And so we're playing the Wizards, and when I tell you, he torched me in that first quarter. Like literally, he gave me 20 points in the first quarter on the same play. Like he just ran the same play every time and did this, like, and I could not guard him.
He averaged 20 points a game at the age of 40 on one leg because his knee was messed up, and he played 82 games at the age of 40 on one leg and played all 82 games.
And Michael comes over and says, I want the ball right there the rest of the game, and don't take me out till I tell you. And so that's fine by me. So with 2 minutes to go in the game, he gives me the sign like, that's enough. I take him out of the game, 51 points at age 41. He came back the next game with 46. And he looked at me and he said, I told you I could still play.
One of the biggest misconceptions in NBA history is that Michael Jordan and the Wizards was complete garbage, and those 2 seasons don't mean anything to his career. And while some brush those years aside, I think Jordan at age 38, 39, even 40, still put up some pretty good numbers and showed he was effective at that advanced age. And as you saw in the intro, his former teammate Tyronn Lue was pretty emphatic Jordan Washington was a really good player. And looking at Jordan's first year with the Wizards in 2002, that year many forget he averaged 22.9 points per game, which compared the entire NBA ranked 10th just behind Dirk Nowitzki. And despite only playing 60 games due to knee injury, Jordan that year cracked 40 points a whopping 5 times. The only players who had more 40-point games were Allen Iverson, Shaq, and Tracy McGrady. And looking at 50-point games, he was tied for first with 6 other players. And to give some context, the NBA in 2002 was just vastly different than 2023, as really in all aspects, offensively and defensively, it was much more difficult. As looking at the league average, when it came to scoring, it was 95.5 points per game, compared to today, which is ridiculous 114.7. So what am I saying? It's pretty simple. Michael Jordan averaging 23 points in 2002. It's much more impressive than you think. As for example, Washington that year as a team averaged 92.8, which means Jordan individually responsible for 24.6% of his team's scoring. Now stay with me. Looking at the NBA now in 2023, it's someone like Devin Booker, who averages 27.28 points. For his Phoenix team, he's responsible for 24.4% of the overall scoring. In summary, Michael Jordan on the Wizards scored a higher percentage of points than Devin Booker on the Suns, which means averaging 23 points in 2002 is like averaging 27.28 in 2023. And like you guys would come to see, when it comes to Wizard years, the stat breakdown, it is pretty difficult, as during the 2002 season, he had a devastating knee injury that would plague him for the rest of his career. So looking at the pre-All-Star break numbers, before his big-time injury, Jordan, I wouldn't say was dominating, but he was a really, really effective player, averaging 25.1 points, tied with Tim Duncan, the 6th best in the NBA. And the Wizards, they were firmly in the playoffs, being 26-21, winning 7 of the last 8 games before the All-Star break. My overall point being, Jordan 2002 was a legit All-Star. Not a sympathy All-Star, just God votes for his name. He was averaging 25 points on a playoff team. And looking at the entire season for the Wizards, Michael Jordan led the team in points, assists, and steals. And compared the entire NBA, there was a total of 6 players who averaged 25 and 5. Of course, Jordan, T-Mac, Kobe, Antoine Walker, Steve Francis, and KG. Averaging 25 and 5 is definitely pretty impressive. But once again, Jordan's overall stats are kind of skewed due to his injuries, as one of the last games Jordan ever had really fully healthy was versus the Heat late in the season. And versus Miami, he scored 37 points. If you say that game versus the Heat was the last game Jordan played for this season, here was his stats. 24.6 points, 6.0 boards, 5.4 assists, 1.5 steals on 42% shooting. Forget his name, forget the era, those stats even today are all-star worthy. And by averaging 24.6 points over a 52-game sample size, that's pretty comparable to some legit superstars of that era, as Vince Carter that year averaged 24.7 points in 60 games, and Chris Webber 24.5 in 54 games. When it comes to Jordan's injuries, it's kind of a blessing and a curse, because unlike a lot of players, he didn't sit out or call it quits and cut off his season at that moment. As after that injury, he actually came back. He was a shell of himself, but he still came back and tried to play. And after that injury, his numbers were just in the tank. He averaged 12 points per game, was a shell of himself, and not effective in the slightest. And that's why I say ode to Jordan that first in the Wizards. It was actually very, very impressive. And even ESPN articles, it was kind of a shocking turn on the Wizards, went from a bottom-feeding team to a legit playoff team at the All-Star break. Now, looking at 2003, Jordan's final NBA season, you could argue this year was actually more impressive than 2002. As Jordan, of course, he was a year older, playing on one healthy knee, played all 82 games, was much more efficient, shooting 44.5%, and his absolute best scored 43 points at the ripe old age of 40. After dealing with so much adversity, so many injuries, Jordan at age 40 to play all 82 games is kind of miraculous, as even players in today's NBA who are in their prime and healthy couldn't imagine sniffing 82 games for an entire season. And even more impressive, Jordan that year in 03 not only played all 82 games, but averaged a whopping 37 minutes per game. If you take 03 Jordan in terms of total minutes, in today's NBA, he would rank first ahead of Mikal Bridges. And in terms of minutes per game, would rank third only behind Kyrie and Pascal Siakam. And speaking of that durability, in all of NBA history, a player past the age of 35, there's only been 4 players to average above 15 points and play 3,000 minutes in a single season. That being Karl Malone, Michael Jordan, Reggie Miller, and Elvin Hayes. Now, speaking of that scoring ability, Jordan in 03, he wasn't top 10, but he was still pretty good, ranking 25th. And out of the 24 players ahead of him, he had a higher shooting percentage than 12 of them. Meaning Jordan, age 40, in terms of high volume scores, he was in the middle of the pack for the peak all-star players and the elite shot makers. And one stat I don't think anyone's ever acknowledged or mentioned is in the month of February, Michael Jordan, at age 40, averaged 27.1 points per game on 46% shooting. For that single month, Michael Jordan had a higher scoring average than Shaq, Dirk Nowitzki, Paul Pierce, and Tim Duncan. And for the entire NBA, ranked 6th in points per game. Now, going more in depth, when it came to clutch time scoring, Jordan once again was in that upper echelon of players. As looking at 03, he had a total of 138 points, being tied for 6th in the NBA. And in clutch time moments, last 5 minutes of the game, shot a pretty good 44.5%. Look, compared to the entire NBA, Michael Jordan that year, you could argue was the most clutch player in the league. As out of those players ahead of him, only one guy, that being Marbury, had more points on a higher shooting percentage. Now, the last thing I do want to cover is Michael Jordan's scoring ability in those 2 collective seasons. As when it comes to 40-point games, looking at all of NBA history, at the oldest 40-point game scores, Michael Jordan has 7 of the 10 oldest games of all time. And looking at 50-point games, he ranks 2nd, only behind Jamal Crawford. And in terms of 40-point games in 02 and 03, versus the entire NBA, he ranked 6th, behind 5 prime Hall of Famers who were all under 30. Wizards Michael Jordan, it's a weird conundrum, because of course, he wasn't even close to the best version of Jordan. but the way people remember him, it's very distorted, kind of revisionist history. As in 02, like I showed you guys, he was a legit all-star player, averaging 25 points, entering that game. And unfortunately, after injuries, he'd have moments of greatness, months of greatness, but never had that stretch of 30 games, 40 games of true Jordan dominance. And I think in large part due to injuries, that's why Jordan's Wizard years are kind of discarded and not talked about. As always, thank you guys for watching, hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.